Hi, and welcome to the Badass Breastfeeding Podcast. I'm Abby Thiering, the Badass Breastfeeder. And that was Josh Wilker, my husband, playing the guitar because we don't have any music this week. Because Dianne Cassidy, my lovely co-host, is out this week, and we're short-staffed this week. So I'm doing this by myself with my husband. I drug him down with me. And so this week, we are going to be talking about breastfeeding from a man's perspective. And I have a lot of questions that I prepared for Josh, Mr. Badass. But he doesn't know what they are. I haven't shown him. So this will be nice and fun to see what he's going to say. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. You're out of your busy schedule.
Oh, thank you.
For traveling all this way.
Yes, it was hard to get here. And I feel a little nervous, actually, to be talking on your podcast. I'm a big fan.
Well, thank you. It's always an honor to have big fans on the podcast. And so, as you all know, mostly, we have a 7.5-year-old son and a 4.5-year-old son. And when I first had Jack, I had never seen anybody breastfeed. Had you seen anyone breastfeed in your life?
I can't remember. Maybe my aunt? Probably. But yeah, I don't think so.
Certainly nothing memorable.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and I had a lot of problems starting off breastfeeding. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking the whole time, like, this isn't going to work out. This is freaking me out. I was anxious. I was Googling a lot of things. It was consuming my every moment. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. I don't know that I knew that it was quite as hard on you as it was until later when we were talking about it some more. I knew it was really hard, and I felt like we were both struggling in the beginning with parenthood in general. But I know it was actually only when I started to hear you tell your story more that I understood how amazing it was that you stuck to it and managed to find a way to do what you wanted to do and get the help that you needed from a lactation consultant. I remember that was a big part of it. But yeah, I've just been amazed by you.
Thank you. So that's a big thing too, because people are struggling with, especially if it's their first child, they're struggling with their transition to this new identity of parent. And then on top of it, you have all the breastfeeding struggles that are making you question your body in a way that you never have and are making you feel vulnerable and anxious and all of these things in ways that you had never felt before. And so so you already answered that. You were dealing with your own struggling to parenthood, which is understandable. I remember so you're right, like getting a lactation consultant was a big turning point for me. But so then when I had it all figured out, I really went really gung-ho. Mm-hmm. I went, well, I'm just going to breastfeed this. I started learning about children who self-weaned and, all of this and how it could be, anywhere between, 3 and 7 or anything like that. And I thought, I'm going to do that. I don't care if he's 7, And I even remember saying I don't care if he's 7 and we're in the house hiding. Because I knew that would just be completely socially unacceptable. But I remember making that decision, and I remember bringing that to you. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that specifically.
I remember you were a little bit hesitant. You were a little like, really?
Yeah, I'm sure that makes sense. I mean, it's all been a gradual awakening for me, and you've always been out ahead of me in figuring things out. And I mean, to me, the whole parenting thing and breastfeeding and birth itself, a lot of it has been like an awakening kind of the nature of the matrix. You know, we're kind of like waking up and looking around and seeing like, wow, things we totally trusted in before don't always have our best interests. And I'm talking about, you know, like at the hospital when there was this, you could sort of after the fact feel this pressure of formula being pushed on us. And you know, there's this tremendous feeling of kind of going with the flow with that. And you pushed back against that. And once I started understanding that myself, I wanted to help push back too. But yeah, the extended breastfeeding was probably that was harder for me to visualize as something that we could do, because by nature I don't want to stand out from the crowd. It makes me nervous. I think probably also, you know, before you start reading about evolutionary parenting and how it's a human norm going back tens of thousands of years, and a species norm, you know, for all sorts of mammals, for the child to decide or to breastfeed as long as is needed, and for there not to be any kind of forced weaning. Once I started to understand that, I was more on board. I was on board with it, but before I knew that, I was like, I still had that. What is it? The myth of like, oh, it's gonna make them feel weird or social. You know, like they'll be old enough to remember it. You know, that's the old saying, like if they're old enough to remember it, then they shouldn't be doing it or something. So that was I had internalized that. So that was a point of growth that I had to undertake. So yeah, I'm sure, and I think, I mean, just being around you, I feel like you've talked about women reaching out to you for help, and often it's around the mother being out farther ahead of the father on this issue in terms of understanding the biological realities as against the kind of the social realities, which are not that sane all the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you mean like the biological uses of the breasts, primarily for feeding the baby, and then what we normally see it as in our culture, sexual and selling products.
Right, yeah. Yep.
So when you were talking, I thought of like 10 things. So this is normally how conversations between me and Josh go. Josh talks and I'm very patient, and then I make notes in my head about all the things that I want to say when he's done. And so you were talking about like all the things that people say about extended breastfeeding, like, oh, they're going to have psychological issues, or it's going to make them sissies, or, you know, make them gay. You know, you hear all these crazy things. And I don't think that I ever thought any specifically thing, like I never thought specifically about it, but probably, I mean, before I had kids, if somebody had said that they were breastfeeding their 6-year-old, I would have been like, that's gross. Like, that's just gross.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have said it was going to make them gay, because that's just a stupid thing to say. But I may have said, and I'm a mental health professional, I may have said like, oh, well, you know, I can see there might be like some long-term psychological harm to that. Because like every single person in our culture starts off like totally ignorant about breastfeeding toddlers. And I think, so you said that you don't see, that you're not sure you saw somebody breastfeeding before me. And I know for a fact I never saw anybody breastfeeding before. I was breastfeeding Jack in the hospital. And so that makes it hard enough, breastfeeding a baby. But even that, you've like seen pictures or heard about it, or seen it in a movie. Like, oh, you knew breastfeeding was a thing that existed. Mm-hmm. But like breastfeeding a toddler, a small child, a 5, 6, 7-year-old, I didn't even know that was a thing. Like, you don't see pictures of it. You don't hear about it. I think now it's getting better because of, mostly right now because of social media. But I never even heard of it.
Yeah, actually, I remember there's a movie by the Swedish director, is it Ingmar Bergman? And there's a toddler being breastfed in that. I remember seeing that and thinking like, this must be a scene about weirdness. But it was actually like, in truth, it was. I think the movie was based on Ingmar Bergman's childhood, and then also my dad has a memory of being breastfed.
I was going to bring up your dad.
Yeah, so it's rare, but it's like we're still close enough to older times, and I guess other countries where it might be a little bit more normal, where there's still glimpses of it possible, but in the mainstream, it's a taboo, really, and it's a pretty powerful one to shatter, which is what you're doing.
Well, and let's talk more about your dad, because actually the badasses, us on Instagram and Facebook and probably on the podcast, all mostly know about him because I post the picture that was, I think you took it. I was breastfeeding Jack. He was a toddler at this time, and I'm sitting next to your dad, and we're all just talking. It's all just like this scene of it's just normal. And when I started breastfeeding, then you start talking about it with everybody. And then we would talk about it with your dad. And we're talking in past tense because your dad passed away a year ago, a little more than a year ago. And so, tell us more about him and his breastfeeding memories.
Well, yeah, he passed away last year. He was 92, so his early years were quite a long time ago. So we're talking about the 1920s, and he was a first generation. I guess, did they call that first? He was the first of his generation, first of his family, born here in America. His mom and dad came over from a region called Galicia, which is Poland or Austria. It was actually Austria-Hungary when they fled. But anyway, so they
fled the Nazis. Yes.
No. It was before the Nazis.
the 20s. Okay.
Right. My grandfather was going to be conscripted into the Austria-Hungarian army, and surely be sent to the front lines to get the worst of World War I is actually what was going on. So he got out of there, and then my grandmother followed soon after. Anyway, they were kind of from a different world, obviously. Well, not kind of. That was a different world in different ways. And, but, and actually, I don't know how this is kind of a digression, really. But I guess I've always thought of my grandmother as like the rock of the family, keeping things going. And so it's kind of nice that there's the earliest memory, I think, of my dad is being breastfed by her. And he was so strongly attached to her, and got such strength from her throughout his life, and it started then. And so that's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's and he was so he had memories of it. So he was 3 or older.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he might have even been as old as 5.
He also tells a story of when he tried went after he had weaned, or his mom was, weaning him. He tried to breastfeed from her at one point, and she kind of giggled and was like, "No, we don't do that anymore." Like, but he was very old at the time. Not very old, but a toddler or a small child. So then we had Exley, and that Jack was about 3, a little younger than 3 when Exley came. And I had some problems breastfeeding Exley, but by that time I just knew I knew lactation consultants. I knew who to call. I knew how to get help. What do you notice? Jeez. What do you notice? What do you notice as being different, I guess, from your perspective between like the early days of Jack and the early days of Exley?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't know if this is the question really, or if this is part of the question, but that home birth meant so much. You know, the experience of Jack being born in the hospital was traumatic, tremendously difficult for you. And the home birth was the polar opposite of that and a real healing thing for the whole family. You know, although Exley's presence was the beginning of a long challenge for Jack. But
the lifelong challenge of having a brother.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I feel like things got off to a good start because of the birth with Exley. I mean, he was sort of, he was kind of naturally brought into the family and naturally all that stuff of him being fed by you, it all just kind of fell into, I know there were some struggles too, which was almost kind of ironic. Like, you know, you're supposed to be the expert. I think you remember.
Well, that's what I was saying. Like, I'm the badass breastfeeder. Like, I mean, if I can't figure out breastfeeding, then like nobody can figure it out. And then I have a newborn, and I'm like, oh my God, what? I forgot to have a newborn. You know, that it's totally, completely different. You get it's such a huge part of your relationship that by the time Exley was born, I was breastfeeding a 3-year-old. And then I'm breastfeeding a newborn, and I'm like, how in the world do you breastfeed a newborn? I don't even remember this. And people, you know, when I reached out to a lactation consultant, or I reached out to a couple actually, they were like, yeah, people totally forget. Like, you just completely forget how to, you know, you forget that your newborn doesn't know all of this stuff. Like the toddler is just, you're barely a part of it when they're breastfeeding, when they're a toddler. And with a newborn, they need, you know, so much help, so.
And my favorite picture from that day is the one we have hanging in the hall upstairs where it's all 4 of us on the bed and you're holding Exley, and Jack's next to you. I'm on the other side of Jack, and you're holding Exley, but you have your hand on Jack. Like you're so focused on caring for both of them at the same time. Even though you have this newborn, it's like, I don't know. I think some people would just be focusing on the newborn, but you were always making sure to see if he was okay. And I think that was probably the nature of how things went from there, is that you were still able to. That was actually a really beautiful thing about continuing to breastfeed Jack through those times, is that was a real way in which he got comfort, and he was still able to get that. And I think the age difference, it was just right where things would be the hardest, because he wasn't otherwise, you know, because he wasn't old enough to really understand what was going on, and he wasn't young enough to be kind of oblivious. And so, yeah, that threw him for a loop, but you were able to keep supporting him in that way in other ways too.
Yeah, well, and that's really funny because actually, like, developmental, you know, experts say 3 years is like ideal. Oh. You know, for spacing. And I'm like, and I agree with you. I'm like, I don't know how this is ideal. Although I will say, I don't think there is an ideal. Right. I think it's going to rock your family in ways that you have no idea until it actually happens. But I think that, you know, being in that picture where I'm touching Jack, I think to me, when I see that, I remember how anxious I was that my relationship with him was going to change, and how was it going to change, and how are we going to, you know, would we be strangers now, and how, you know, I was just consumed with anxiety about it. And I had Exley in my hands, and as soon as I had Exley in my hands, Jack could be standing right next to me, and he appeared to be 20 feet away. I couldn't. It was so strange. I couldn't get him close, and breastfeeding was like one of the ways that, that I think he could, that we could maintain that. So I don't have any more questions. I wish we could take questions from the people, but
I can always get back here. It's hard for me to get here, but if you really need me, I could come back for another time.
Yeah, thank you. But you came back, you were on a business trip, and you came back from your business trip with a really interesting story about something that you saw in a graphic during like a lecture. And I know you're a little nervous about whether you could explain it, but let's work really hard to explain it because I think it's really cool. And
sure. Yeah.
It's a good, it's just so, let's just go.
Yeah. Just being married to the Badass Breastfeeder has given me eyes for certain things in the world and that I wouldn't have otherwise noticed. So yeah, I was at this, watching this presentation. I work for a company, education publisher, which is a really cool company. I'm very happy to be working there. Seriously.
No, it's true. It's a cool company.
And but they were talking about this business strategy, which I think is based on a book that's out there called Lead and Disrupt. And basically, you try to. The basic premise of it is that you have your core part of the business that kind of sustains you from year to year. And then you try to also develop new parts of the business. And so how do you do those two things at the same time? And so they had this graphic to kind of show the concept. And it was a sort of a superhero, a woman superhero who, has super strength, and she's holding up a building. And on her it says lead. So that's the lead part.
She's holding up the building with one arm.
With one arm, right. And the building is like the core part of the industry, and she's holding that up with her super strength. And then in her other arm, she's holding a baby. And the baby is the kind of the growth part, the disrupt part as far as the strategy goes, that's going to become maybe a new business for the company at some point. And you have to kind of grow it. And in the picture, the baby's holding a bottle, or drinking from a bottle, and I was like, how much better would that be if she was breastfeeding the baby? Not just in terms of normalizing breastfeeding, but for the actual image, like she's this superwoman holding up the business, but also growing the new business with herself. But I understand in the context of that presentation in the workplace, it would have been iconoclastic. Like it would have, it wouldn't have. It just, I can see why they didn't do it.
It would have completely fallen apart because people would be like, "Oh my God, there's a boob!"
Yeah, right.
Oh my God, I can't believe I'm looking at a boob, and they wouldn't have even been able to pay attention to the whole concept of it.
Exactly. Yeah, which is so weird that the most normal central part of human life has become a weird has become a taboo that you can't. It's not exactly a taboo because it is kind of in sort of very constricted ways. Oh, isn't it beautiful to see a brand new newborn breastfeeding? Where you can't see anything. That's okay, but anything older than an infant, or in any kind of like ways that you don't see a lot. I don't know. I'm sort of rambling, but it's it's a strange world we live in, and I'm glad that my wife is trying to change it, helping to change it.
All of the badasses are changing it. Well, thank you for traveling all this way to our studios to be a part of this show.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, good. People don't like when you can hear all those noises in the...
That was a kiss.
Thank you all for listening. And we would like it if you could please share your experiences in the review section on iTunes, and maybe you will be our review of the week. And we didn't do a review of the week this week, and I'm sorry because I forgot. So we will do another one next week. You know, like I said, we're short-staffed, but we wanted to still make it pretty cool. But also head to badassbreastfeedingpodcast.com for sponsor links, for promo codes, for a long list of awesome resources and all of our other episodes. And you can find information about how to schedule your very own lactation consultation with Dianne. Bye.